The wind wails across the black volcanic plain, snow blows horizontally, covering anything that remains still. In Iceland, winter does not simply come, it falls like a cloak, obscuring the sun for months. Temperatures drop well below freezing, storms sweep in from the North Atlantic, bringing gale-force winds strong enough to knock a person flat. And back in the 9th century, when Norse settlers first reached these shores, they encountered a challenge that would push their resourcefulness to its limits. How can you construct a home if no trees exist? The Vikings who sailed across the ocean from Scandinavia were used to timber halls, long rectangular structures with upright wooden walls and steeply pitched shingled roofs. They were skilled at working oak and pine, splitting logs into planks. They understood how to erect a frame capable of supporting snow loads. But when they set foot on the beaches of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, they discovered landscapes nearly completely lacking forests. Only sparse birch thickets clung to the slopes. No oak, no pine, only rock, grass, and peat, extending to the horizon. The issue wasn't just about architecture, it was a matter of survival. Winter in the North Atlantic leaves no room for error. A poorly insulated shelter leads to frostbite, hypothermia, and death. Fuel is limited, daylight disappears, the ground freezes solid. So the Norse settlers did something unexpected, something that would come to define their ability to survive in these rugged territories. They ceased resisting the environment and began constructing using it. They transformed the frozen earth into walls. They topped their houses with grass and excavated their homes directly into the ground. They built structures so thoroughly merged with the terrain that from afar they resembled grassy slopes with doorways. These were turf houses, long houses, with walls constructed from peat and sod blocks. They were sufficiently thick to retain body warmth and sturdy enough to endure for generations. And they lived inside these earth-covered halls. Families survived months of darkness and cold, staying warm with just a single open hearth and the insulation provided by the surrounding earth. This is the tale of how Vikings engineered survival in one of Earth's most brutal climates. They employed the very elements that posed a threat to their lives. The initial difficulty was the building material. On mainland Scandinavia, timber was plentiful. A Norse chieftain could cut down a dozen oaks and erect a hall in just weeks. However, in Iceland, only about 30% of the island had even sparse birch woodlands, and those trees were small, nothing comparable to the tall pines of Norway. Archaeological studies have shown that early settlers experienced a timber shortage right from the start. High-quality structural wood was simply unavailable, and what they had was turf. Under the thin layer of grass covering the island were deep deposits of peat, partially decayed plant material, compact and dense. This peat could be cut into blocks reminiscent of bricks and stacked. These blocks were light enough to transport but heavy enough to remain in place once set. And importantly, peat possessed a quality wood didn't have. It was an exceptional insulator. The cellular structure of decayed plant fibers captured air in numerous tiny pockets, forming a natural barrier to cold. A turf wall about 3.3 feet thick could retain interior heat much more effectively than a wooden wall of any thickness. Thus, the Norse started cutting. They sliced rectangular pieces of sod from the slopes, each block about the size of a bread loaf. Roots still intertwined through the grass on top. These sods were piled in a herringbone pattern, with each layer tilted a bit so that the weight pushed inward instead of outward, avoiding structural failure. The walls grew gradually, block by block, until they reached a thickness of about 3.3 to 6.6 feet. From the exterior, these walls appeared alive. The grass on top continued growing, and roots wove the blocks together. In summer, wildflowers blossomed on the roof, and the house became indistinguishable from the landscape. But turf by itself could not hold up a roof. For that, the Norse required timber, and timber was the most valuable resource in their new home. They could not waste it on walls or floors. Every beam had to be used wisely. So they looked to the ocean. Arctic currents are an intriguing and mighty phenomenon. In Siberia, rivers like the Ob, Yenisei, and Lena transport meltwater northward through the taiga forests. Along with that water come logs, trees knocked down by storms, riverbank erosion, and spring floods. These logs float into the Arctic Ocean, where they get trapped in sea ice. The ice drifts gradually over months or years. Driven by polar currents, it moves westward across the Arctic. A portion melts near Greenland's coast. The rest travels south past Iceland, and when warmer waters cause it to break apart, the Norse receive the logs it had been transporting. This was seen as divine intervention. The amount of driftwood reaching Iceland's shores fluctuated greatly from one year to the next, but whenever it appeared, it was considered precious. By law, coastal landowners owned any wood that washed up on their land. Workers would drag the logs to higher ground, let them dry, and then split them with care. One quality beam was enough for a door frame, and a few posts could hold up a roof. The wood wasn't required to support the walls. That task fell to the turf. Its only job was to carry the roof and give the building a framework. Studies of ancient Norse dwellings show that when driftwood was plentiful, entire logs were used without splitting. But as resources became scarcer, they changed their methods. Later, people would cut logs lengthwise to get two beams from one. They repurposed wood from deserted structures and bought small quantities from Norway at a high cost. Every piece was conserved, reused, and handed down from one generation to the next. In an era when most materials could be replenished, turf could always be harvested. Wood was the one exception. Building followed a methodical, labor-heavy procedure. The first step was site selection, usually on a slope for better water runoff. The area was leveled, and a base of flat stones was placed. These stones had a dual function. They kept the turf walls from resting on wet ground, which would lead to decay, and they created a solid foundation capable of supporting the heavy earth structure. Even Greenland's churches were built this way, with stone foundations and turf walls over 5 feet thick. After the base was ready, the timber frame was erected vertically. Upright beams were either buried in the earth or placed on stone supports. Horizontal crossbeams linked them together, and a long ridgepole stretched the entire length of the house, forming the roof's backbone. The framework was kept simple, only enough to maintain the building's form. Next came the turf. Workers placed sod blocks around the frame, tilting them inward at about a 4 or 5 degree angle. The walls went up gradually, with every row packed tightly against the one beneath. When complete, the base of the walls was nearly 7 feet thick, thinning out a bit as they rose. Then came the roof. Driftwood rafters were placed across the ridgepole, and on top of them, additional turf was piled in multiple layers until the whole building was enclosed. Seen from above, the dwelling resembled an elongated green hill with a doorway at one side. In winter, snow accumulated on top, providing extra insulation. Rainwater seeped into the turf and was carried off by the grass roots. The structure was alive, allowing air to circulate. Over time, it sank and blended into the slope. The typical Norse turf house had a rectangular layout, known as a longhouse, and the term was accurate. Lengths ranged from about 40 feet to more than 65 feet. Widths were between roughly 13 and 20 feet. The central space called the hall or farm kitchen was the home's core. Here the family conducted all daily activities: living, eating, working, and sleeping. In the middle of the hall lay the hearth, but it wasn't like today's fireplaces. It was a shallow hole excavated from the ground, lined with rocks, and filled with smoldering peat or driftwood. No chimney existed. Smoke drifted up to the ceiling, exiting through a small opening known in Old Norse as a louver. That vent was purposely small, big enough to release smoke, but not so large that it would let too much warmth out. When the air was still, smoke would linger heavily in the hall, causing eye irritation and darkening the turf walls and timber beams. Tending the fire required continuous effort. A person had to keep it going by adding fuel, adjusting the vent, and making sure the coals didn't die out overnight. Yet that modest flame was essential for survival. The thermodynamics of a turf house functioned in this way. Warmth from the fire spread outward uniformly. In a standard timber structure, most of that warmth would be lost through the walls and ceiling. But in a turf house, the massive earth walls soaked up the heat and stored it. Because turf has high thermal mass, it requires a long time to heat up, yet once warm, it gives off heat gradually. The walls grew warm to the touch. The indoor air, held in by a low ceiling and few windows, remained comfortable even after the fire died down. The occupant's body heat further increased the temperature. Breathing, cooking, steam, and everyday activities all contributed to the warmth trapped inside the earth envelope. This created a unique microclimate. Outside, it could be as cold as 20 degrees below freezing, which is -4 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds screaming at 40 miles per hour. Yet inside, under about 6.5 feet of turf, the air could be comfortable enough to sit in shirt sleeves. Findings from archaeological digs in Greenland and Iceland indicate that well-kept turf homes could be dozens of degrees warmer inside compared to the outdoor temperature. The dwelling acted like a heat battery, collecting warmth during daylight hours and dispensing it after sunset. This shielded residents from the severe temperature shifts of the Arctic environment. The floor plan amplified this efficiency. On either side of the main room, builders erected low seats from wood or stone. These seats doubled as chairs during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. Relatives slumbered next to each other, occasionally using furs or woven blankets for comfort. Visitors and paid workers might also rest there. Everybody huddled near the fire. This was a matter of survival, not merely custom. Being nearer to the blaze meant staying warmer. Dispersing would squander warmth, so the building design forced people to live together, positioning them in the best heat-saving arrangement possible. In certain homes, extra chambers were added. A stable for livestock might connect to the main room, divided by a partition but beneath the same roof. Animal warmth, akin to human warmth, increased the temperature. The Norse recognized this principle. They did not heat the stable. Instead, the stable heated the residence. In richer homes, a dedicated kitchen or pantry might exist, but those were less important areas. The central room and its fireplace were the focus of everything. Lowering the floor was yet another method. Numerous sod houses were partly buried, excavated into the ground so the floor sat beneath the surrounding land. This underground-style layout lessened wind exposure and took advantage of the soil's natural insulation. Beneath the freezing depth, the soil keeps a fairly steady temperature throughout the year. By putting the house into that layer, builders made certain that the floor did not radiate cold upward. The dirt piled against the walls provided an extra insulation barrier. Wind could not directly attack the walls. Snow might accumulate on the roof, but the walls stayed shielded. Effectively, the house evaded the weather. Yet this method was not exclusive to the Norse. Throughout the Arctic, other societies independently hit on the same idea. In the Labrador region, Inuit groups built winter homes from blocks of mossy sod with timber frames and central fire pits, housing extended families during the worst winter months. In Alaska, the Thule people, predecessors of today's Inuit, erected pit houses using driftwood and whalebone supports, then covering them with sod. Some of these constructions are more than 3,000 years old and look strikingly similar to Viking sod homes: rectangular shapes, thick dirt walls, low doorways, and central fire pits. The physical laws do not vary with culture. Cold remains cold, soil insulates, fire provides heat, and people everywhere discovered this. This also applied in Scotland, where Viking settlers founded communities on the Orkney and Hebrides Islands. Sod became the typical building material. Excavations at places like Bro of Bursay have uncovered 10th and 11th century Viking longhouses. These featured stone and sod walls stretching over 65 feet long. They had central fire pits, dirt floors, and the same partially buried layout as their Icelandic equivalents. This method traveled with the Norse regardless of where they went, modified for local supplies but essentially identical. However, sod dwellings required upkeep. Sod decays, grass dies, rain wears away. Every few years, the outer layer of sod had to be replaced. Fresh sods cut and placed over old roofs demanded special attention. Water gathering on the roof could leak inward, drenching the inside, so the roof needed regular resodding. The grass was kept short, drainage ditches cleaned, and the home was like a living entity that needed constant care. If neglected, it would sink back into the slope. This ongoing renewal meant that sod houses seldom lasted more than 1 or 2 generations without significant repairs. Yet the outline remained. When a dwelling fell into disrepair, a new one might be erected on the same foundation, using the same stone base. The identical floor plan. Over centuries, layers of habitation built up. Archaeologists excavating Viking sites often uncover evidence of multiple construction phases. Older walls buried under newer ones, fire pits rebuilt on top of previous ones, and floor levels raised as trash and ash accumulated. The home became a palimpsest, with each generation overriding the previous. Social organization shaped the dwelling, and the dwelling shaped social life. In medieval Europe, Buildings loudly announced status. Kings dwelt in stone castles, nobles had timber manors, and peasants managed with wattle and daub. But in Iceland, this hierarchy vanished. Everyone chiefs, farmers, laborers lived in sod. Nature was the ultimate leveler. You could not construct a stone fortress with no quarries, nor raise a timber hall with no forests. So even the most affluent families resided under sod roofs. Prestige, when it was exhibited, was shown indoors. A wealthy chief could panel his longhouse with intricately carved wood, brought in at high cost. He might have a house inside a house, a small wooden structure built within the larger sod shell, warmer and more prestigious. Yet from the outside, his home appeared the same as a poor farmer's, a grassy mound with a door. Such architectural uniformity was rare for that period and mirrored the tough realities of living in the North Atlantic. Nature ignored rank, the cold showed no favoritism, and survival relied on identical strategies for everyone. Nevertheless, the longhouse was more than just shelter. It was the heart of family identity, the spot where ancestry was recalled and honor upheld. Sagas written centuries later still remember the longhouses of famous chiefs, like Ingjald's dwelling at Bergtorgsfjall and Egil's at Borg. These were not grand palaces, but they held deep meaning. The fireplace was where oaths were sworn, where arguments were resolved, and where stories were told during lengthy winter evenings. The flames witnessed everything. The hearth was also the focus of religious life. Until Christianity came in the late 900s, Norse households followed a pagan tradition with rituals performed at home. The family leader, occasionally a god, or chieftain priest, presented gifts to deities and spirits at the domestic altar. Usually positioned by the hearth, the fire carried deep meaning. It embodied existence, heat, and illumination. Allowing it to die out invited catastrophe. Following the shift to Christianity, many of these symbolic associations carried over into the new religion. Turf churches were small and built just like ordinary homes. They were low, rectangular, with sod roofs, looking identical to other structures except for a cross at the door. Inside, a modest hearth kept the congregation warm. The building design stayed the same. Only the ceremonies inside evolved. Certain researchers suggest that the arrangement of northern halls had cosmic significance. How the building was oriented, where the hearth sat, and how space was divided may have mirrored Norse ideas about the cosmos. North and South might stand for separate worlds, the living versus the dead, or humanity versus the supernatural. East and West could align with male and female spheres, or day and night. This remains conjecture, derived from subsequent readings of sagas and cultural comparisons, yet it implies the turf house served beyond mere practicality. It formed a symbolic area, fixing the family within the universe. Turf houses faded gradually once Iceland and Greenland joined European trade routes. By the later Middle Ages, imported wood grew easier to obtain. Wealthier households started constructing mixed buildings, stone bases, wooden frames, yet still covered with turf for warmth. In Greenland, Norse colonies ultimately collapsed, deserted by the 1400s as the climate deteriorated and European supply chains broke down. Those turf homes sat vacant, gradually sinking into the ground. In Iceland, however, turf building continued far longer, right through the 1800s. Countryside farms kept using sod. The technique was economical, efficient, and well adapted to the terrain. Turf construction only ceased with the arrival of modern supplies like concrete, steel, and milled timber. Nowadays, several preserved turf houses survive, kept up as museums, Gloombear, Lofus, among others. These structures recall an era when Icelanders constructed their dwellings entirely from the land. Contemporary architects have revived the concepts behind turf houses. Earth-berm structures, living roofs, and passive solar designs all draw from the same reasoning that directed Viking builders a millennium ago. Earth provides insulation, thermal mass evens out temperature swings, and reducing exposed area cuts heat loss. These are not novel concepts, they are age-old, honed out of need in the planet's most severe environments. The turf home is evidence of human flexibility. People confronted a landscape that provided almost nothing. No wood, no stone for large builds, no metal, no excess of any resource yet. The Norse managed with what they had. They transformed grass into building walls. They used sea currents to bring wood from forests they never visited. They excavated the frozen earth to create dwellings. In the process, they achieved not merely survival but prosperity. Families were raised, communities established, sagas written, and new territories explored. The cleverness did not lie in major breakthroughs, but in careful observation, knowing how heat travels, water flows, wind erodes, and fire burns. It meant piling 10,000 sod blocks to erect a wall. In carefully splitting one log to produce two beams, the turf house functioned as a living machine. Through constant attention to a fire that must never die, its design came not from engineers but from farmers, fishers, and households who had to succeed because failure wasn't an option. Many centuries have gone by since the final Norse clan gathered around a peat flame inside a sod-roofed hall. Yet the lesson remains. Survival does not mean dominating nature. It involves comprehending, cooperating with, and reshaping its resources into answers. The Vikings lacked the convenience of importing necessities. They worked with what was available: dirt, turf, driftwood, rock. From these simple substances, they constructed dwellings that stood for generations, protecting whole families during winters that would have killed those less inventive. Ultimately, the turf house transcended mere building it, embodied a worldview. It demonstrated that no climate is too severe, no material too limited if one is open to new thinking. It proclaimed that the earth underfoot, the grass you tread, the very dirt beneath you, all can be turned into refuge, heat, and protection. This lesson is etched into countless green slopes throughout the North Atlantic. Creativity doesn't always manifest as towering spires or shiny metal. Sometimes it takes the form of a simple earthen mound, with an entrance humble and silent, but cozy within while the outer world is locked in ice.